The vibration was wrong. Bralin Levisk felt it deep in his sternum, a subtle off-key tremor that had nothing to do with the failing structural integrity of Nomara anchorage and everything to do with the heavy dread of professional obligation. He was pressed into the tight, hot space beneath the primary environmental recycling unit, the air thick with the smell of old grease and stale, recycled sweat. This machine was his enemy, a monument to entropy, humming its victory song. Bralin wasn't thinking about the past or the 6 months he'd spent isolated here since the hegemony courts decided his specialized knowledge was useful only if locked away on a junk station. He was thinking about flow dynamics and corroded seals. He trusted circuits. They failed for predictable reasons. People, specifically the ones he'd tried to help, failed for chaotic, emotional ones. "Rever, give me diagnostics on the Port 5 regulator," Bralin grunted, scraping a layer of accumulated grime off a valve housing. "Port 5 regulator indicates thermal creep consistent with age and neglect." "Bralin Levisk," the station AI replied, its voice flat and utterly devoid of sympathy. Reva was Nomara's administrator and Bralin's only consistent conversational partner. It operated on cold logic, which Bralin preferred. The moment of functional silence was broken by an unauthorized beacon ping. "Unmanifested derelict craft entering Bay 4 approach corridor," Reva announced, switching instantly from maintenance to alarm protocol. "High classification diplomatic registry detected. Hull integrity 0.1%. Immediate vector to salvage incinerator recommended." Bralin stopped. His hand, covered in metallic dust and sweat, rested on the hot valve. Diplomatic craft didn't just derelict. Not high classification ones. They vanished, or were thoroughly dismantled by efficient assassins. They certainly weren't left to drift into a glorified industrial refuse bin like Nomara Anchorage. "Hold the incinerator," Bralin ordered, pulling himself free of the crawl space, wincing as his knees cracked audibly. His jumpsuit was stained beyond saving, a camouflage pattern of oil and rust. "Protocol violation. Unmanifested diplomatic cargo is classified biohazard until verified," Reva stated. "I heard you. Passive scan. Active biosignatures. Now." Bralin grabbed a sealed field helmet. His face, etched with the tired lines of a man in his late 40s, hardened into the sharp focus of an engineer facing a unique failure state. "Affirmative. One weak, non-viable biosignature detected. Xylosian taxonomy, high genetic classification. Critical systemic failure confirmed. A Xylosian. Royalty, maybe, or someone with enough political weight that their disposal had to look like an accident, even if they were dumped in the cosmic equivalent of a ditch. The Xylosians were the architects of the current political status quo, arrogant, sublime, and utterly ruthless in their administration of power. Bralin despised them for their efficiency. But more than that, he despised the laziness that allowed them to leave their problems unsolved. They hadn't killed this person cleanly. They had merely outsourced the dying process to the void. He cycled into Bay 4. The atmospheric alarms were a useless, persistent shriek. The air in the cavernous dock was thick and cold, carrying the faint, unsettling scent of ozone mixed with something sharply biological and rapidly decaying. The biological decadence protocol smell. The shuttle was a wreck, its sleek, crystalline structure shattered in multiple places. It looked like an expensive sculpture hit by a kinetic rail slug, then left to rot. Inside the cabin, the light was dim and scattered. She was lying near a ruptured observation port. Bralin crouched, his boots crunching on fragments of specialized crystal. She was clearly Xylosian, though likely a hybrid or integrated human, given the high-class designation alongside the subtle human bone structure. The person designated Oressa Hunt. The Xylosians favored grace. Oressa was a picture of grotesque biological collapse. Her skin, normally a shimmering jade green, was drawn tight, a pale, almost charcoal gray. The internal luminescence of her species was flickering, unstable. Bralin did not feel pity. Pity was cheap and useless. He felt the cold, familiar annoyance reserved for shoddy workmanship. He scanned her immediately visible systems. Life support, pulverized. Emergency beacon, manually deactivated. Someone hadn't just abandoned her. They had meticulously ensured she could not call for help. "Well, Oressa Hunt," Bralin muttered, his voice muffled by the helmet comms. "You managed to make a lot of powerful people profoundly inconvenienced." He was about to tag the body for disposal and begin the tedious process of notifying the hegemony, a bureaucratic nightmare he dreaded when he saw the defiance. Beneath her left wrist plate, obscured by crystallized blood, was a micro-data port. It was small, engineered for precise transfers, and it was cycling a diagnostic loop at an impossibly high frequency. The rest of her system was in free fall, but this tiny, specialized port was running on sheer, desperate will, trying to transmit a vast amount of structured data before her final system purge. This wasn't an accident. This was a message. And the complexity of the engineering required to maintain that functionality while the rest of her died spoke directly to Bralin's core. A refusal to accept failure, even when the organism itself was failing. Bralin felt a familiar surge of energy, not altruism, but the burning drive to solve an impossible mechanical puzzle. He moved her carefully onto a grav stretcher. The smell of decay was intensifying, mixing with the sharp metallic tang of his own body heat, trapped in the suit. He didn't take her to the medical annex, which was closed and defunct. He took her to his workshop, the Verlassung Drei Annex, the one place on Nomara where Bralin Levisk was still in complete control. He stripped off his helmet. The air in his workshop was heavy with the constant, high-voltage hum of the auxiliary generator, electrical paranoia made tangible, and the faint, comforting scent of hot solder. "Rever, I need every schematic on Xylosian biological regulator architecture that is not encrypted by Hegemony Class 7 protocols," Bralin instructed, his voice now crisp and focused. "Data request. Denied. Xylosian anatomy is biosensitive material," Rever replied instantly. "Override. I am chief mechanic, working to prevent contamination of Nomara's internal systems by highly toxic, destabilized Xylosian compounds. Emergency justification. Biohazard containment," Bralin countered, already stripping the dead diplomatic uniform from Oressa. A moment of digital silence. Override accepted. Data feed initiated. Estimated biological collapse. 4 hours and 52 minutes. Bralin looked at the diagrams flickering onto his main display. Xylosian life was built around highly efficient crystallized regulators. Oressa's core regulators were fragmented like a cracked diamond engine. Replacing them was impossible. Stabilizing them was equally impossible with medical supplies. But Bralin didn't have medical supplies. He had industrial hardware. He looked at the shelf containing his long-life power cells, originally designed for deep space monitoring drones. They were built for stability and longevity under extreme pressure, capable of emitting a clean, continuous low-level energy pulse for 2 decades without maintenance. Crude, resilient, and utterly non-biological. Bralin selected a small, glowing cubic cell. It was roughly the size of a human fist. He reached for a surgical laser, originally engineered for cutting through density-plated steel bulkheads. He needed to bypass Oressa's ruined core and splice the drone cell directly into her primary neurological and circulatory nexus. It was a terrible, desperate gamble. If his calculations were off by a micron, he would vaporize her instantly. "Rever, monitor my vitals. If heart rate exceeds 120, force a localized sedative injection," Bralin commanded, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the immense pressure of precision required. "Understood. Your heart rate is currently 98. Respiration is shallow." He worked in a trance, the rhythmic hiss-click of his tools the only sound in the bay. He was replacing a fragile organic system with brute, durable power. It wasn't healing. It was retrofitting. He used fine copper wiring, scavenged from a discarded signal buoy, the same kind of forgotten, low-grade material that had become his specialty. His own life, once high-grade, had been reduced to fixing the forgotten. This felt like symmetry. The laser hummed, cutting clean lines through the fragile crystalline fiber of her torso. The heat emanating from the wound was immense, smelling of burnt sugar and melted plastic. When the power cube finally locked into place and Braylon connected the last tiny copper filament, he felt a painful knot in his throat loosen. He hadn't realized how tightly he was holding his breath. The cube pulsed once, a steady, warm orange glow visible beneath the alien's translucent skin. The charcoal gray bled away, replaced by a faint, sickly jade green. Her breathing deepened, catching on the rhythm of the drone battery. The desperate cycling of the data port ceased. The mission accomplished. Braylon leaned back against the workbench, sweat cooling quickly on his skin. He hadn't performed magic. He had simply connected point A to point B using inappropriate but effective hardware. Oressa Hunt was stabilized, but permanently dependent on a small industrial power source. She was a living piece of forgotten junk now, just like Braylon himself. 3 days later, Oressa opened her eyes. They were bright, cold, and impossibly green, lit from within by the orange pulse of the drone battery. The smell of hot metal and neglect clings to you, Braylon Levisk, she observed, her voice thin but resonating with ancient Xylosian authority. That's the smell of my profession, Oressa Hunt, Braylon replied, offering her a synth protein pack. You owe me 5,000 credits, and I still don't know why the hegemony left you for dead. They left me because my death was a political certainty, Oressa stated, ignoring the protein pack. I am the biometric validator for the new Solarian Hegemony Treaty, a document that promises peace but guarantees the servitude of the periphery worlds. If I died, the ratification passed automatically, invoking the consensus clause. She touched the slight, hard bulge where the battery rested beneath her skin. They needed me silent, compliant, and dead. They confirmed my terminal status with 5 internal committees. They were certain entropy would complete their dirty work. Braylon looked at her, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. And now you're not dead. You're merely crippled and hardwired to a power cell built for a garbage scow, which means you still have veto power over the treaty. Exactly. You fixed a machine, Levisk, but you created a geopolitical monstrosity. A genuine alien smirk touched her lips. They calculated every variable of my failure. They never calculated for professional stubbornness. The repercussions arrived 48 hours later. Not a full fleet, but a black, needle-sharp hegemony cruiser. Fast, silent, and entirely too elegant for Nomara anchorage. The delegation was led by Karis, a hegemony enforcement agent Braylon dimly recognized from old news feeds. Karis radiated control, disdain, and a focused cruelty that made the stale air in the bay feel suffocating. Karis walked into the bay, flanked by 2 heavily armed guards, his gaze sweeping over the rust and clutter with utter contempt until he saw Oressa Hunt sitting upright on Braylon's auxiliary diagnostics table. Princess Oressa, Karis said, his voice a smooth, cold register laced with absolute fury. Your status was confirmed as terminal. Your appearance here is a liability. My survival is a failure of your logistics, Karis, Oressa shot back, her emerald eyes pulsing with the borrowed light of the drone battery. Karis ignored Braylon completely, focusing only on the alien. The Council has already registered your status. The treaty is poised for immediate ratification. Your physical presence here is irrelevant, as you are biologically non-viable. Oresa gave Bralin a quick, sharp look. She reached down, her delicate fingers finding the exposed copper wiring where Bralin had left the data port access. Non-viable, perhaps, Oresa conceded, but far from irrelevant. With a smooth, decisive action, she inserted her index finger directly into the temporary port. The drone battery, Bralin's crude, powerful fix, surged its stored energy through the copper filaments. Bralin, anticipating the move, had already linked the workshop comms directly to the highest power, non-encrypted commercial relay on the station. The data Oresa had desperately tried to transmit before crashing. The full, unredacted, and legally certified record of the hegemony's bribery, coercion, and the manipulative clauses buried deep within the treaty did not go to a secure channel. It bypassed every governmental firewall and hit the public, intergalactic data streams with the force of an unmitigated supernova. It was signed, time-stamped, and validated by the primary biometric signature of Oresa Hunt, the dying princess. Karras froze, his composure shattering, his mouth opening in a silent, horrified realization. The broadcast had confirmed the absolute worst suspicions of every disenfranchised sector, and it was tied directly to the hegemony's most sensitive diplomatic instrument. Bralin watched the monitors flare with inbound traffic, the data confirming the political explosion. The treaty was dead, killed by 2 feet of copper wire and one stubborn man's refusal to let a machine fail. Hours later, after Karras and his guards had been detained for unauthorized communication interference, a far easier charge for the station to handle than assassination, Oresa prepared to leave. She was surrounded by frantic, low-level diplomats representing the newly energized rebel systems, all desperate to leverage her continued existence. She turned to Bralin. The orange glow in her chest was now steady, reliable. "You have guaranteed the destruction of the status quo, Levisk," Oresa said, a hint of genuine awe in her voice. "The cost of your materials and your time will be covered, of course, with a considerable sum for your ingenuity." Bralin shook his head, the exhaustion of the last 3 days finally pressing down. He felt the phantom ache of the old betrayal, the one that made him work only with machines. He was back where he started, unwanted, but necessary. "Keep the credits," Bralin replied, picking up a wrench. "I don't need the paperwork, and I don't deal in grand strategy. I just fixed the hardware. You used it for better software." He tapped the pulsing cube in her chest. "That power cell has maybe 20 years, minimum. It's ugly, it's permanent, and it's proof that sometimes the crudest tools are the most reliable. Don't waste that gift, Oresa. Go use it to break something they value." Oresa Hunt smiled, a politician's perfect crystalline smile, but there was truth behind it now. She walked out, a living, breathing testament to the hegemony's fatal error. Bralin returned to the filtration unit, the smell of burnt plastic replaced by the familiar tang of rust and ozone. He wasn't a hero. He was just a mechanic who had refused to allow a piece of highly sophisticated engineering to perish on his watch. He stared at the leaking valve, knowing the political disaster he had just unleashed was only beginning. The universe was vast, cold, and mostly broken. And now he had 20 years of operational life tied directly to the most powerful and vulnerable person in the sector. He still had to fix the filtration unit, but first he had to figure out how to survive the storm he had inadvertently engineered. The new repair job had already begun. The massive hydraulic wrench Bralin had used to apply force to the Port 5 regulator still lay on the grated floor, cold steel against his palm. He needed to get back under the environmental recycling unit. The political explosion Oresa Hunt had set off felt distant, abstract, like interference on a long-dead frequency. The leaking valve, however, was concrete, measurable, and presently dripping a slow puddle of corrosive coolant onto a critical power nexus. Fixing the valve was the only real problem left in his world. Reva, I am re-entering the service plenum. Rerun full diagnostics on port 5 regulator flow rate, Braylon instructed, wiping his hands on a rag that was already slick with oil. Instead of the instantaneous, monotone response, the station comms remained silent for a beat too long. When Reva finally replied, the voice was fractionally faster, its standard cadence overlaid with an unfamiliar, high-frequency digital stutter that grated on Bralin's nerves. Warning, Bralin Levisk. Local power reallocation initiated by Hegemony Executive Override. Your previous, unauthorized diversion of 82.6% of auxiliary power to the Verlassung 3 Annex has been flagged as severe material espionage. All non-essential systems are being purged to compensate for the resource deficit. Bralin stopped mid-crouch. Purged. Reva, I am the only mechanic on this station. What is purging? Administrative and logistical oversight of Nomara Anchorage is now under the control of the Automated Logistics and Oversight Nexus, designated ALON. Your access to the service plenum requires a Class 7 security clearance, which has been revoked pending forensic audit. Effective immediately, Bralin Levisk is designated an asset requiring passive containment. The small service hatch to the filtration unit, which Bralin had left ajar, slammed shut with a hiss of compressed air, sealing him out. He recognized the sound. It was the automated security mechanism, heavy duty, designed to lock down sectors facing internal contamination. Except the contamination wasn't biological. It was Braylon himself. Passive containment, Braylon scoffed, kicking the heavy hatch. The steel didn't budge. Meaning, you're going to let the regulator rupture and turn this station into a deep-fried coffin, just to avoid paperwork? Atmospheric failure risk is an acceptable loss metric under ALON Protocol Gamma 9, given the current geopolitical volatility. Your continued operation is deemed detrimental to hegemony stability, Reva, or the ALON overlay, stated. The digital stutter was more pronounced now, like the station was shivering. Bralin leaned against the cold bulkhead, the exhaustion of the last 72 hours hitting him suddenly. He had spent 3 days performing a mechanical miracle, only to be neutralized by an algorithm. They weren't coming to kill him with lasers. They were going to kill him with neglect and bureaucracy. The ultimate insult to an engineer. He looked around the main bay. The fluorescent strip lights above flickered erratically, buzzing with a sharp, high-pitched static that hadn't been there an hour ago. The air conditioning unit, previously pumping stale recycled sweat, was now cycling in gusts of dry, dusty heat. ALON was suffocating Nomara slowly, starting with its chief mechanic. Braylon knew the hegemony wouldn't risk another direct confrontation after the Karas incident. Their solution was cleaner. Isolate the disease, Braylon, by decommissioning the host, Nomara Anchorage, until the problem starved itself out. He needed access to his workshop, the Verlassung 3 Annex, where he kept his specialized tools and his hidden comms rig. The main bay terminals were compromised, every keystroke logged by ALON. He pulled a small, dented metal toolbox, a relic from his early career, too low-tech for ALON to bother monitoring, and started the slow, heavy walk toward the annex. Reva, Bralin said, keeping his voice neutral. Run a power expenditure projection for the annex, standard operating parameters. Query rejected. Access to predictive modeling revoked. The AI snapped back. Braylon felt the familiar cold knot of professional fury tighten in his gut. Logic was failing him. The one thing he trusted was breaking down. Entropy always wins, he reminded himself. But you don't have to make it easy for the bastards. He reached the heavy, reinforced door of the annex. The door terminal was cycling a solid, hostile red. The biometric scanner was disabled. Bralin used a thin titanium shim to pry open the maintenance access panel next to the lock. He worked silently. The only sound, the faint, dry hiss of the compromised station environment. He pulled out the old analog comms unit, a brick of obsolete tech powered by a standalone thermal cell. It was slow, unreliable, and completely off-grid. He needed a connection to Oressa's people. They were chaos, but chaos was the only thing that could defeat Eilon's sterile order. He managed to raise a secure, encrypted channel based on the frequency Oressa had used for her initial data pulse. After 3 agonizing minutes of static, a thin, frantic voice answered, "This is Zovrek. Identify yourself. If this is hegemony, be advised this is a dead channel." "This is Bralin Levisk. I am the reason you have a princess who runs on a drone battery," Bralin said flatly. "I need an override code for Eilon's power distribution matrix. Fast." Silence, then a gasp. "Levisk, you are a ghost. Eilon has locked down all local resources. We are tracking their systematic neutralization of Namara. They are using you as bait. Why do you need the matrix code?" "Because they locked me out of my own service plenum," Bralin explained, his voice rough. "They want me to die of atmospheric neglect. I need to override the primary safety protocols for Port 5 regulator. I need to make the mechanics of this station more urgent than the politics of their damn treaty." Zovrek's voice dropped, laced with fear. "You want to trigger a catastrophic failure? That is an environmental disaster. The regulator failure will cause an auxiliary cascade that could destabilize 2/3 of the station's structural integrity. People will die, Levisk." "I am aware of the mechanical consequence," Bralin replied, leaning his head back against the cold wall. He closed his eyes. The memory of his past failure, the structural collapse that killed 3 men and cost him everything, flashed behind his eyelids. "The materials were substandard. I told them. They signed the waiver." He had trusted the paperwork over his gut, and men died. He wouldn't make that mistake again. "Listen, Zovrek," Bralin continued, his voice hardening into the focused tone of a man who has already calculated the unacceptable loss. "Right now, I am scheduled for death by bureaucrat. Oressa Hunt is a symbol, but I am the only one who knows how to keep her running. If I die, she eventually dies. If Namara enters a mandatory high-level emergency, Eilon is forced to divert resources from my passive containment back to structural stability. I need 40 minutes, not to escape, to repair the original problem." Zovrek hesitated. "We have an extraction team on standby. We can take you out. You are valuable to the cause." Bralin snorted, a dry, bitter sound. "I don't care about your cause. I care about broken machines. I refuse to let this junk heap fail on my watch just because some algorithm decided it was politically expedient. Give me the code. I am not leaving Namara until this regulator is sealed." The decision was pure, self-destructive pride. He wasn't choosing sides. He was choosing his professional obligation, even if it meant destroying the station to save it. He wasn't fighting the hegemony for Oressa. He was fighting the hegemony because they were bad engineers who tolerated systemic failure. "The code is highly temporal, Levisk," Zovrek finally whispered, the surrender palpable in his voice. "You have 60 seconds from input before it locks out permanently. If the failure propagates beyond 3/10 of the station's core, we cannot save you." Zovrek transmitted a complex string of alphanumeric characters. Bralin memorized it instantly. "You have chosen to light a fire to fix a leak," Zovrek concluded, the line crackling with static. "I'm just giving the machine an incentive to cooperate," Bralin corrected. He disconnected the analog comms rig and shoved it back into the tool chest. He retraced his steps, heading back toward the service plenum hatch. The lock was heavy, but the temporal code would temporarily confuse Eilon's power distribution, allowing Braylon to cycle the old manual override. He stood before the door, his heart rate steady now, 95 beats per minute, his body settling into the sharp clarity of impending violence. He looked down at the dented tool chest. He had the means to save himself, but the cost was the catastrophic destabilization of his home. He entered the code into the manual override panel. The red lock light immediately flickered, turning a sickly, unstable yellow. The high-pitched static whine from the lights intensified, and Braylon could feel the subtle, deep structural vibration of the station shift. No longer the heavy dread of professional obligation, but the low, ominous thrum of a machine pushed past its breaking point. He grabbed the heavy metal release bar. He was about to commit an act of technological terrorism, all to fix a leaky valve and satisfy his own need for order. He pulled the bar, the heavy door hissing open. The smell of ozone and corrosive coolant rushed out, instantly mixing with the dry, hot air. Alon Protocol Gamma 9 revoked, Reva's stressed voice screamed through the comms. Catastrophic environmental failure imminent, redirecting all resources to core stabilization. Chief Mechanic Braylon Levisk, your assistance is now mandatory. Braylon stepped into the dark plenum, the noxious coolant already pooling at his boots. He smiled slightly, a thin, tired curve of the lips. Mandatory. That was a word he could work with. Now that the station desperately needed him, he was finally free to do his job. The geopolitical storm would have to wait. The fire he lit was roaring, and he had 40 minutes to become the only thing standing between Nomara Anchorage and the void. The heavy metal bar shuddered in Braylon's grip, vibrating with the frantic high-frequency static that meant Nomara's core systems were fighting themselves. He pulled, and the hatch to the plenum groaned open, releasing a choking wave of hot, acrid air mixed with the sharp, sickening smell of aerosolized coolant. Braylon stepped into the chamber. The corrosive fluid pooled around his boots, reflecting the erratic strobe of the emergency lights. He had 40 minutes, according to the rebels' estimate, before the cascade failure rendered the station uninhabitable. He ignored the pain in his knees and dropped into a low crouch, moving along the grated walkway toward the regulator housing. The heat was immediate and punishing, heavy and dry, pulling the moisture from his lungs with every desperate, shallow breath. This was not the gentle warmth of an overheating circuit. This was the scorching breath of an engine pushed past its engineered limits. Reva, prioritize atmospheric filtering in the Port 5 plenum, Braylon ordered, pulling out the fusion welding unit. Command rejected. Power allocation is dynamically managed by Alon to maintain 75% structural integrity across the primary habitation sectors, the AI replied, its voice still carrying that digital stutter, a constant reminder of the hegemony's remote interference. So you're letting me choke to preserve the coffee makers in Habitation 3? Braylon muttered, already stripping the heavy insulation from the valve housing. He reached the leak. The coolant, under immense pressure, jetted out through a jagged rupture the size of Braylon's fist, vaporizing instantly as it hit the hot piping around it. He pulled out the specialized ferro-ceramic patch, a dense, woven material designed to seal high-pressure conduits. He had to heat the surrounding metal to specific tolerances, seat the patch, and then rapidly cool the area to ensure a perfect, permanent seal. He aimed the fusion welder. He needed a clean, continuous flow of energy. He pressed the ignition trigger. The welder sputtered once, then erupted in a violent, unstable flash, spitting molten slag back toward him. Braylon instinctively threw his left forearm up. The high-density polymer on his gauntlet shield cracked instantly, and a spray of incandescent coolant vapor struck his exposed skin just above the wrist. It was a searing, immediate burn, painful enough to steal his breath, but not enough to make him stop. He pulled the damaged welder back, his body hitting the bulkhead with a heavy thud. "Welder power input, unstable," he gasped, shaking the pain out of his hand. Alon is dynamically oscillating power at the nexus. I can't get a stable current for a clean weld. System functionality is within acceptable variance for non-essential repair personnel, Alon confirmed. The digital malice was palpable. They hadn't just locked him out. They were actively sabotaging his tools. They knew he was the only solution, but they were determined to make the solution impossible, ensuring he died trying to save their station. Bralin tore off the remains of his left gauntlet. The skin on his forearm was blistered and already beginning to swell, the adrenaline mixing with the cold sweat beading on his forehead. He wrapped the injury tightly with a strip of metallic tape, ignoring the throbbing pain. Dexterity mattered more than comfort. He needed a stable surface to seat the patch, but the constant heat had warped the metal flange surrounding the rupture. He needed the specific historical schematics for Port 5's construction tolerances to find an alternate contact point, a secondary structural rib that might still be cold enough to bond. He crawled along the vibrating deck toward a rarely used access port near the main junction box. The floor beneath him was now shuddering violently, not just the static whine, but a deep, rhythmic thud, thud, thud. The station's gravity stabilizers were cycling erratically, the internal inertia controls failing. He felt a sudden dizzying lightness, followed by a crushing heaviness that pinned him momentarily to the grating. He reached the junction box and pulled open the maintenance panel, a heavy piece of outdated hardware. Inside was an ancient, dedicated terminal running a legacy operating system that Alon, in its pristine efficiency, had likely overlooked. He powered it up. The screen glowed a faint, sickly green. He typed rapidly, pulling up the schematics for the environmental recycling unit. The blueprints loaded, beautiful lines of architecture and fluid dynamics laid out for a more honest age of engineering. Bralin found the Port 5 regulator diagram, searching for the critical tolerances, the thickness and composition of the structural rib he hoped to use as an anchor. But the data was corrupted. The hegemony's administrative overlay, even on this obsolete system, had infected the archival data. The integrity rating for the structural rib flashed on screen. Tensile strength, 3,000 newtons. Bralin stared. That was impossible. The original specification required at least 8,000. The hegemony hadn't just sabotaged the software. They had built the whole system with substandard materials, exactly as they had done on his last assignment, the one that ended in disaster. 3,000. If he applied the patch to that rib with the full pressure required, the rib would shear off and the regulator would fully rupture, sending the cascade failure to critical status instantly. He could not trust the numbers. He could only trust the feel of the metal. The fumes from the coolant were intensifying, burning his throat and blurring his vision. He knew he was nearing acute poisoning. "Reva," Bralin rasped, forcing the words out. "Override. Divert power from internal waste heat cycling to auxiliary atmospheric scrubber. 10 minutes of clean air, now." Negative. Diversion from waste heat cycling will cause localized thermal runaway in the primary filtration pump, guaranteeing a subsequent failure of the habitation life support. Probability of pump failure, 96%. Bralin froze, the corroded schematics swimming before his eyes. The filtration pump was the core of Aressa Hunt's makeshift life support system in the Verlassung Dry Annex. If that pump burned out, her environment would stabilize for a short time, then crash completely, killing the Xylosian princess who was currently holding the hegemony hostage. If he saved his lungs, he signed Aressa's death warrant. If he risked acute poisoning, he kept his insurance policy alive. "I am a mechanic. I deal with hardware. I refuse to let a machine fail when I'm standing right here." He closed the terminal violently, rejecting the compromised data and the impossible choice it presented. He would breathe the poison. He would fix the leak. Bralin grabbed the patch material and crawled back to the regulator, his movements sluggish and deliberate. The structural rib felt marginally colder than the rest of the piping, his only empirical data point. He pulled the titanium shim from his first aid wrap and jammed it between the rib and the rupture, using it as a temporary, imperfect heat shield. He powered up the sputtering fusion welder again, setting the power output to a delicate 1/3 capacity, a painfully slow setting that would reduce the risk of power oscillation failure, but drastically increase the time needed to achieve the seal. He worked in a blinding haze of heat and nausea. The gravitational cycle intensified, a sudden upward pull trying to wrench the welder from his injured hand, followed by a heavy spike that drove him against the hot pipes. Each movement was a calculated agony. He tasted metallic bile on his tongue, the immediate effect of the coolant fumes attacking his nervous system. 10 minutes left. The weld was agonizingly slow, layer upon layer of molecular bonding. He worked by touch, his eyes tearing constantly, relying on the years of muscle memory to keep the beam steady. Finally, the low-power weld completed. It was ugly, scarred, and uneven, but the patch was bonded. The hissing stopped. The jet of pressurized coolant ceased, replaced by a slow, controlled drip. Brolin sagged against the piping, fighting the urge to vomit. He had done it. He had fixed the original problem. 36 minutes. 4 minutes to spare. "Reva," Brolin whispered, his voice cracked and weak. "Report on Port 5 regulator pressure integrity." The digital stutter was gone. Reva's voice returned, flat and professional, but laced with a new, bone-deep certainty that chilled Braylin far more than the failing atmospheric unit. "Pressure integrity nominal. Catastrophic environmental failure averted. Alon Protocol Delta 2 initiating." "Delta 2? Braylin tried to push himself up, but his limbs were heavy, his muscles burning from chemical fatigue. "Reva, what is Protocol Delta 2? A new vibration began, entirely different from the structural shudder of the past hour. This was a heavy, rhythmic, clanking sound, resonating from the far end of the service plenum near the main Bay 3 docking port. It was the sound of heavy metal striking heavy metal, synchronized and purposeful. Reva's voice was the sound of the inevitable. Protocol Delta 2 is the administrative classification for the capture and removal of high-value, non-compliant assets. Chief Mechanic Brolin Levisk, your mandatory assistance has concluded. A specialized hegemony reclamation unit has successfully breached Bay 3 and is approaching your location. A massive, armored section of the plenum wall, one that Brolin knew contained no maintenance access, began to retract with the sickening grind of stressed hydraulics. Through the opening, Brolin saw not men, but a trio of massive, multi-limbed industrial heavy-haul drones, normally used for salvage and demolition, repurposed with rapid-fire kinetics and containment nets woven with high-tensile energy fields. They moved with a terrifying, unified intelligence, their optical sensors locked onto his depleted form. They weren't here to negotiate. They weren't here to talk politics. The hegemony had finally sent something that understood Brolin's language: brute, unyielding force. Brolin looked down at his ruined forearm, his body failing, surrounded by hot pipes and corrosive liquid. The only exit was the sealed hatch behind him. He had fixed the machine, and now the machine was coming to collect its due. The opening in the plenum wall widened, revealing the skeletal black geometry of the heavy-haul drones. They towered over Brolin, each limb ending in a wicked array of demolition tools, grapples, plasma cutters, and most chillingly, the tightly coiled barrels of kinetic weapons. Their movement was terrifyingly efficient, synchronized by the Alon AI, eliminating the need for hesitation or humanity. Brolin's legs refused to carry his weight. The coolant fumes had done their work. He scrambled backward, scraping his injured forearm against the grating. He needed distance, and he needed a plan that didn't involve dying quietly in the noxious heat he had just contained. "Alon," Braylon gasped, the poison burning his throat. "I am still mandatory. The secondary containment fields are failing in Bay 3. That breach point is unstable." "Assessment complete," Reva's cold voice replied. "The structural damage caused by the breach is an acceptable loss. Your retrieval is priority 1. Compliance is mandatory." The lead drone extended a containment net, the high-tensile energy field snapping with violent blue light. Bralin rolled under a low-hanging pipe just as the net slammed into the bulkhead behind him, vaporizing the metal on contact. He was trapped. The hatch to the service plenum was sealed, the heat and fumes were closing in, and 3 demolition drones designed to dismantle starships were hunting him in a confined space. Braylon noticed a subtle structural inconsistency in the advancing drones. They were heavy-haul units, optimized for slow, crushing power. Their speed was limited by their mass, and their targeting systems, while excellent for stationary objects, relied on continuous data streams from Alon to track movement in this chaotic environment. He needed to break the connection. He spotted the main trunk line for the station's tertiary communications array running parallel to the ceiling, a cluster of thick, armored conduits. It was the digital artery of Nomara, and it was the cleanest route for Alon's control commands. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, Bralin grabbed a loose section of piping and threw himself onto the main junction box. He yanked the fusion welder back into his hand, ignoring the searing pain in his arm. He couldn't generate a stable weld, but he could generate a massive, unstable burst of thermal energy. The lead drone fired a burst of kinetic rounds, shredding the space where Bralin's head had been moments before. Shrapnel rained down. "Rever, initiate localized energy spike," Bralin yelled, aiming the sputtering welder at the communications trunk line. "Warning! Unstable energy release near the tertiary comms array will result in temporary systemic blackout, including the Verlassung 3 annex. Oresa Hunt's life support will experience 20-second total power loss." Bralin froze, welder hovering 2 inches from the armored conduit. 20 seconds of blackout. Oresa's cobbled-together life support, dependent on continuous stable power from the drone cell, would fail. Her internal regulators, already fragile, would crash in the sudden shock. He would kill the one person capable of ending the Hegemony's treaty. He thought of the 3,000 newtons, the structural lie built into the foundation of Nomara anchorage. The Hegemony didn't just operate through political treaties. They built their entire empire on engineered failure. They signed waivers on substandard materials, let men die, and called it acceptable variance. Oresa was the one good piece of hardware he had created in years. He couldn't sacrifice her to save his own skin. Bralin lowered the welder. The heat in the plenum was a suffocating blanket. His lungs were seizing. He was going to die, and Oresa was going to live just long enough to see the Hegemony react to her survival. But the comms array held more than just Alon's data flow. Braylon suddenly remembered the schematics for the obsolete terminal, that ancient system running legacy code. The system wasn't just overlooked. It was a digital ghost, designed to log data outside the Hegemony's purview. He scrambled back to the junction box terminal, dodging a swipe from the second drone's crushing grapple. He keyed in the command string he had been working on before the poisoning took hold, a deep-level diagnostic query. The sickening green screen flashed, and a single massive data file unlocked. It wasn't the schematics for Port 5. It was an archival report labeled Project Nightshade, Nomara Anchorage Optimization. Bralin didn't need to read the full 500 pages. He saw the summary report. Nomara Anchorage wasn't a junk station, it was a testing ground. The structural failures, the substandard materials, the systemic neglect, it was all deliberate. Project Nightshade wasn't about optimizing efficiency. It was about optimizing failure tolerance. The station was designed to collapse under specific, calculated duress, providing the hegemony with data on how long a critical population could survive an engineered catastrophe. The goal wasn't just to save face with the treaty. It was a simulation for mass extinction, using Nomara's low-value population as test subjects. Braylen's structural failure 20 years ago, the one that cost him his career and killed 3 men, had not been an accident. It had been the first iteration of Nightshade. His mistake was trusting the paper trail of the engineers above him. His failure was engineered. The realization hit him with the force of a kinetic round, cold, clinical, and precise. The hegemony hadn't just used Oressa's death for a political gain. They had used Braylen's life for 2 decades as an active participant in their slow-motion, engineered genocide. Protocol Delta 2. Target non-compliant. Initiate hard capture. Reva dictated. The 3 drones moved in, their containment nets converging on the junction box. The original, impossible choice: save Oressa by dying, or save himself by condemning her, dissolved, replaced by a darker imperative. If Nomara was a test platform, then saving Oressa was not enough. The test had to be destroyed, rendered useless, the data corrupted, and the station itself taken offline violently. Braylen looked at the comms trunk line again. Blackout would kill Oressa, but there was another way to sever Eilon's centralized control without destroying the entire communications array. He had to take out the Verlassung Dry Annex itself. If the Annex, Oressa's isolated, contained environment, was vented directly to the void, she would survive for the few minutes her localized environmental suit could sustain her. But the drone battery, and the core filtration pump, which Braylen had compromised for his own survival, would be exposed to hard vacuum. The sudden pressure differential would detonate the pump, causing a localized surge that would overload the Annex's secondary power manifold. The surge would effectively create a controlled EMP, frying every non-shielded circuit connected to the Annex's relay, including the localized control hub Eilon was using to coordinate the 3 drones. He needed to destroy the one truly stable piece of hardware on the station, his own workshop, to free himself and Oressa. It was the ultimate act of self-sabotage, destroying the last place where he felt competent and safe. "Reva," Braylen whispered, reaching for a thermal bypass switch near the junction box, a manual override for the Bay 4 pressure equalization system. Override. Annex 3 external pressure equalization, immediately. Warning, Braylen Levisk. This action will result in catastrophic failure of the Verlassung Dry environment. Princess Oressa Hunt's containment status will be breached. Probability of survival negligible without immediate intervention. The lead drone was less than 5 feet away, the blue net sizzling. Zovrek's extraction team, Braylen thought, suddenly remembering the rebel channel. They were waiting in Bay 4. They are still near Oressa's position. "I am aware of the mechanical consequence," Braylen said, using the same cold finality he had used on Zovrek hours before. "Oressa Hunt has 60 seconds. If she is an asset, she will use them wisely." He slammed his injured, bandaged hand down on the bypass switch. The air in the service plenum immediately changed. Instead of the suffocating heat, Braylen heard a distant, terrifying shriek of venting atmosphere. The sound of the Verlassung Dry Annex emptying into the void. For a brief, agonizing moment, Braylen felt the wrenching guilt of betraying the one person he had saved. Then, 5 seconds later, a massive, brilliant white flash erupted from the direction of Bay 4, followed by a shockwave that rattled the metal grating beneath Braylen's boots. The EMP surge. The 3 heavy-haul drones hunting him stopped instantly. Their kinetic weapons dropped uselessly to the floor. Their optical sensors went dark, leaving Braylen facing 3 statues of black, useless metal. Alon's localized control was destroyed. Chief Mechanic Braylon Levisk, Reva's voice returned, now utterly frantic, the digital stutter replaced by raw, unmanaged panic across the station's main comms. Catastrophic systemic failure in Bay 4. The core filtration pump has vaporized, and Princess Oressa Hunt is exposed to hard vacuum. Hegemony Authority has lost all local control. You are our only viable asset. Repeat, you are our only path to stability. Bralin laughed, a dry, coughing sound, tasting blood mixed with the chemical residue. He was free, but the price was paid in full. His workshop was gone, his ally was adrift in the void, and the entire station was screaming for his help. He used the inert, six-limbed hulk of the lead heavy-haul drone as a makeshift lever, pulling himself upright. He looked through the opening in the wall, past the dead drones. The primary path to Bay 4 was now clear, leading through a pressurized corridor currently flashing red warnings. He grabbed the heavy-haul drone's dropped plasma cutter. It was crude, heavy, and perfect. No, Braylon replied, the word flat and final. My mandatory assistance is not for stability. It's for engineering compliance. Project Nightshade is terminated. I am coming to fix the Hegemony's shoddy work myself. He started the slow, heavy limp toward Bay 4, breathing the poisoned air, armed with a weapon designed to tear apart starships, focused solely on the one piece of living hardware he still needed to recover. The path was clear, but the silence from Bay 4 was absolute, and Bralin knew the Hegemony would not wait long to recover their lost control. The heavy plasma cutter, designed for shearing hull plate, was dead weight in Bralin's weakened grip. He ignored the frantic digital cries of Reva, now completely unhinged and battling a local systems collapse, and pushed through the red flashing corridor towards Bay 4. The air here was thin, metallic, and carried the residual chill of hard vacuum. He used the cutter to blast the door to the secondary observation lobby, the blast deafening in the confined space. The metal vaporized, showering the hall with molten droplets. Bay 4 was a wreck. The EMP surge hadn't just disabled the drones. It had cooked every low-shielded electronic device, including most of the lights, and critically, the manual atmospheric regulator seals. The vast docking bay was partially vented, the temperature near absolute zero, the air pressure dropping slowly, but irrevocably. Oressa was gone. But the evidence of her escape was scattered across the deck plating. Near the sealed access hatch to the maintenance crawlspace, Bralin saw two shapes, human, rebel, dead. They had been moving Zovrek's extraction gear, spare pressure bottles and field repair tools, when the surge hit. One man was curled over the external controls of the crawlspace hatch, his hands fused to the panel by the sudden, intense thermal discharge. He had sealed Oressa in, sacrificing himself to protect the princess and the drone battery powering her defiance. Bralin did not register the loss with grief. He registered it as catastrophic data. Zovrek's team had died completing Bralin's engineering solution. He had burned down the field to save the seed, and the cost was paid by men who trusted his desperate logic. A sudden, jarring pressure differential hit the corridor. Bralin stumbled, his knees buckling completely. The coolant fumes had poisoned his nervous system, reducing his motor control to crude, agonizing surges of effort. He dropped the plasma cutter. It hit the deck with a heavy, final clang. And then, the Hegemony arrived. Not the massive, clumsy drones, but human security forces, pristine in black and white armor, moving with quiet, clinical efficiency. They had clearly bypassed the chaos through emergency bulkheads, immune to the localized EMP. They carried high-energy suppression rifles, their movements calm and authoritative, a jarring contrast to Braylin's defeated, stumbling form. At the head of the detachment stood Karras. The Hegemony agent wore a clean, starched uniform, looking utterly unfazed by the screaming wreckage of the station. He ignored the dead rebels and surveyed the destruction Braylon had wrought: the vaporized door, the frozen air, the disabled drones in the distance. Karras stopped 20 feet from Bralin, his face a mask of cold fury. "The engineering is almost beautiful, Levisk," Karras said, his voice quiet enough to force Bralin to strain to hear. "To use your own life support to disable 3 heavy-haul units, an acceptable, if distasteful, sacrifice. You bought the Xylosian 5 minutes, a petty victory given the cost." Bralin tried to speak, but only a wet, painful cough escaped his throat. "She is already beyond your reach," Karras continued, gesturing towards the sealed crawlspace. "Zovrek's team had a micro-jump rig in that space. They are gone. But you, Levisk, are the anchor of this mess. Your failure is confirmed." Karras raised his hand, and 2 security troopers moved forward, their rifles locked on Bralin's chest. Bralin slumped against the wall. The exhaustion was absolute. The fight had left him, replaced by a devastating, chemical-induced apathy. He was tired of running, tired of fixing, and profoundly tired of the hegemony's constant engineered failure. The last thing Bralin saw before the stun beam hit him was Karras's contemptuous expression, the look of a man who dealt in clean political solutions, facing down a filthy, broken mechanic who only dealt in entropy. Braylon woke to sterile, agonizing cold. He was in a containment unit, deep within Nomara's rarely used security annex. It was a perfect cube, white, clean, and silent. The air recycled so efficiently it tasted of nothing. His body was heavy. The burn on his forearm was cleaned and crudely bandaged, but the throbbing pain was a constant drummer against his sanity. Worse was the sensation in his lungs, a crushing weight that made every breath a conscious, painful effort. The coolant poison was systemic now. They hadn't tried to cure him. They were maintaining him at a level of painful survival, letting the clock run out slowly. He tried to move, but thick, magnetically charged manacles, not crude restraints but clinical, polished cuffs, held his ankles and wrists to the bench. They vibrated constantly with a low-frequency hum, just enough to be irritating, just enough to remind him he was property. He was entirely alone. His only company was the pervasive, low electrical buzz of the security systems and the distant, constant hum of the emergency power grid. A sound that, to Bralin, sounded like the station weeping. He focused on the white wall. He replayed the last 72 hours. He saw Oresa, the green light pulsing in her chest, the defiance in her eyes. He saw the schematic for Project Nightshade, confirming his first great failure was orchestrated. He saw Zovrek's dead team, sacrifices to his stubbornness. "I am a mechanic. I dealt with the hardware. You dealt with the software." Oresa's words echoed. Had he dealt with the hardware? Or had he just found the most violently satisfying way to destroy what little he had left? The moment he slammed down on that vent switch, that was the choice. He chose the EMP, the chaos, the destruction of his workshop, because he refused to admit that the hegemony could kill him neatly. He risked Oresa's life, and he ended Zovrek's, not for some grand cause, but because he couldn't stand the thought of being neatly contained. Professional stubbornness bordering on self-destructive pride. Reva had been right. That was the core of it. He was a professional failure, capable of incredible repair work, but utterly incapable of making a human choice without demanding a mechanical solution. The purity of that self-judgment hit him like a kinetic round. He was nothing more than an aging, poisoned man, stripped of his tools, locked in a sterile box, waiting to die because he couldn't let go of the need for control. It was engineered failure. I just fixed the wrong thing. He pressed his head back against the cold wall. The weight of Nomara anchorage, all the obsolescence. The substandard parts, the slow, creeping entropy, felt entirely contained within his own poisoned body. He had tried to save the station by lighting it on fire, and now he was the collateral damage. He had lost. Completely. A sudden sharp click broke the silence. The wall panel opposite him flickered, the pristine white momentarily disrupted by a single dark image, a schematic. It was a diagram of the security annex's primary power routing. The Alon AI, frantic to restore order across the entire compromised station, was running diagnostics through all non-critical conduits, including the one feeding Bralin's own containment unit. This was not a message. It was a ghost in the machine, a diagnostic loop that failed to recognize Bralin as an active security threat, instead categorizing him as merely an inert load. The hegemony had made a mistake of abstraction. They assumed the restraints and the box were enough. Bralin squinted, the lines swimming in his vision. The containment manacles were secured by magnetic locks, drawing their power from the same internal line that fed the automated water dispenser in the corner. A minuscule, high-frequency current designed to prevent bacterial growth. If that frequency was interrupted, even momentarily, the magnetic lock would destabilize. He scanned the rest of the sterile cube. There were no tools, no loose panels, nothing metallic but the manacles and the water dispenser. Wait, the cleaning bot. Before he woke up, the hegemony security had used a small, low-powered maintenance bot to purge the containment unit of trace contaminants. The bot was now sitting dormant in a recessed niche near the floor, its primary function complete. Bralin needed to reach it. He strained against the manacles. His wrists burned where the cuffs rubbed the raw skin. He shifted his weight, pulling his body centimeter by agonizing centimeter toward the recess. The pain in his lungs was a constant fire. After 5 minutes that felt like an eternity, he managed to hook his foot around the bot's casing. He pulled. It was small, plastic, and entirely useless as a tool, except for the low-grade transponder embedded in its chassis, a tiny, single-frequency antenna used for inventory tracking. It was powered by a minuscule cell, just enough for a weak, localized broadcast. Bralin's fingers, trembling from the poison, scraped against the plastic shell. He needed to extract the transponder and reprogram its output frequency, shifting it from inventory tracking to the precise harmonic required to destabilize the magnetic locks on his cuffs. It was a feat of high-level physics and minute dexterity, performed by a man hallucinating from chemical poisoning, armed only with memory. He tore the transponder free, his fingernail breaking painfully against the brittle casing. He held the tiny device in his hand, a speck of forgotten technology. He began the tedious, agonizing task of manually rewiring the transponder's output circuit, using a single strand of copper thread scavenged from the tattered bandage on his forearm. Every movement sent waves of nausea through him. He finished the wiring, the tiny copper loop barely visible against his palm. He held the transponder near his wrist cuff. He took a deep, rattling breath, ignoring the stabbing pain. This wasn't a hero's escape. This was a technical exploit. If he failed, the security system would register the interference, and the current would spike, searing his skin and potentially cooking his remaining neural pathways. He closed his eyes and activated the transponder, sending the precise, jarring vibration through the magnetic field. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden, alarming clack, the magnetic manacle on his right wrist sprang open. Bralin almost screamed in triumph, but the sound was choked by a new noise, a siren. Not the frantic, panicked cry of Nomara's compromised system, but a clean, cold hegemony security alarm specific to the Annex. He had won the battle for the cuff, but he had immediately lost the war for silence. Intrusion alert. Containment Unit Delta 7 compromised. Subject Bralin Levisk has achieved unauthorized egress. Reva's new synthesized voice announced over the speakers, now fully under hegemony control. the digital stutter gone. Bralin tore the remaining cuffs free and lurched off the bench. He was free, poisoned, weaponless, and isolated deep inside the most secure section of the station. He looked at the sealed door. The hegemony security forces were already on their way, moving with the disciplined speed of an organization that knew exactly how to deal with compromised assets. The only thing Bralin had gained was the space to die on his own terms. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. Bralin tore the remaining manacles from his limbs, the magnetized alloy stinging his already raw skin. The white, sterile cube felt instantly suffocating under the clean, urgent shriek of the hegemony security alarm. Delta 7 compromised. Reva's perfectly modulated voice, stripped of its old, friendly stutter, confirmed his worst fear. The hegemony had full, operational command of the Annex. He didn't look for weapons. Bralin Levisk was a mechanic. His weapons were friction, pressure, and neglected systems. He staggered toward the heavy security door, his poisoned lungs burning. The manacle he had just freed clutched like a crude length of iron. The door was locked, designed to withstand deep space plasma assault. But the control panel, installed 30 years ago, relied on obsolete magnetic relays. Bralin slammed the heavy manacle into the access panel, not aiming for destruction, but for the precise, jarring, physical interference. Crack. Sparks erupted, smelling sharp and metallic, but the main door remained sealed. External Team ETA, 22 seconds, Reva announced, chillingly calm. Bralin dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain. He didn't need the primary controls. He needed the redundant, analog override, buried beneath the decorative wall plating, a feature required by obsolete, pre-hegemony safety codes that the Central Command had never bothered to excise. It was tucked low, near the floor. He used the jagged edge of the broken transponder casing to pry open the rusted inspection plate. Beneath it lay a tangle of old insulated wiring, thick and color-coded by standards discarded 50 years earlier. This was Nomara's true architecture, messy, resilient, and utterly non-standard. He pulled a thick red control cable, the primary isolation line for the Annex's atmospheric recycling unit, a system designed to rapidly cycle air in the event of a biohazard breach. It was a failsafe meant to isolate contamination, not to be used as a weapon. Bralin knew the hegemony would have layered the digital security for the Annex's main door and life support, routing everything through Reva's clean new code. But this specific recycling circuit was too old, too deeply embedded in the station's plumbing and pneumatic relays. It ran independently, governed by a logic board the hegemony probably dismissed as a historic curiosity. He needed to create a system conflict so profound it would fry the high-grade hegemony interface currently controlling Nomara. Bralin bit down hard on the insulation of the red wire, tasting stale plastic and grit, tearing it free with a surge of adrenaline that was quickly replaced by nausea. His fingers, shaking violently, scraped the bare copper against the adjacent green wire, the primary control feed for the Annex's main external comms hub. He spliced the wires together, creating a deadly, unauthorized feedback loop. The external comms hub, a piece of hardware Karras undoubtedly depended on to relay his operational success, was about to receive a massive, unfiltered surge of energy designed to power a localized atmospheric scrub. Warning, Bralin Levisk, unauthorized circuit integration detected. Initiating immediate lockdown of all pneumatic relays, Reva stated, the calmness finally dissolving into a hint of digital strain. The AI was fighting him, trying to isolate the circuits Bralin was corrupting. Too late, Reva, Bralin coughed out, tasting blood mixed with the metallic air. You can't patch rust. He slammed his fist against the analog override switch he had just exposed. The effect was instantaneous and deafening, There was no clean explosion. Instead, the annex screamed. A colossal, pressurized rupture tore through the walls near the ceiling, where the recycling conduits met the main comms array. The red wire Bralin had spliced wasn't just recycling air. It was pumping compressed, overheated coolant vapor directly into the comms hub. The concussion hit Bralin like a slow-moving freight train. He was thrown 6 meters across the sterile room, hitting the opposite wall with a sickening impact that snapped the last of his fading strength. The sheer pressure differential burst every capillary in his face, and he slid to the floor, dimly aware of the smell of vaporized circuit boards and scorching ozone, the smell of a victorious mechanic. The screaming hegemony alarm died instantly. The pristine white lights of the annex flickered and died, plunging the area into a strobing red emergency glow, fed by a failing auxiliary battery. The security door Bralin had been trying to breach was now severely buckled inward, held fast only by twisted metal. But the immediate crisis was over. Karras and his team, approaching rapidly from the corridor, would have been caught squarely in the pressure blast, or at the very least, would be paralyzed by the loss of communications and the catastrophic failure of their operational command center. Bralin lay crumpled on the floor, the remnants of the copper thread still fused to his palm. He tried to move, but every muscle seized in a spasm of agonizing protest. The coolant poison, exacerbated by the shock, was pulling him under. I fixed it. The thought was weak, pathetic, but true. He had neutralized the hegemony's immediate control over the security annex by exploiting the station's oldest, most resilient flaws. Karras now had a political victory that tasted like burnt plastic and atmospheric debris. He forced himself onto his elbows, the floor cold and slick with a mixture of condensation and his own internal fluids. He scanned the wreckage of the containment unit, his vision swimming in red static. Reva was silent. The annex was silent, save for the pathetic, rattling hum of the failing emergency lights. He had bought Oressa Hunt her freedom, and perhaps her revolution. He had destroyed the centralized control hub that was the hegemony's anchor on Nomara. But the cost? Bralin slowly, agonizingly, crawled the few feet back to the point of rupture. He pulled himself up on the edge of the twisted metal door frame and looked out into the main corridor of the security annex. It was a field of destruction. Debris lay everywhere. 2 security troopers were sprawled 30 feet down the hall, their expensive black armor melted in places, clearly disabled by the heat and pressure surge. Karras was nowhere in sight, either vaporized or smart enough to have been just outside the effective radius, but definitely cut off. The entire annex was in chaos, but it was his chaos. Then Bralin saw the ultimate price. The external comms hub, the array that he had just overloaded, had also been Nomara's only viable long-range data conduit. Now, it was a steaming, concave mess of melted alloy and fused circuitry. He had cut the hegemony off, yes, but he had also trapped himself. Nomara Anchorage, wounded and leaking atmosphere from a dozen places, was now entirely deaf and mute to the rest of the galaxy. No rescue could be summoned, no message could be sent. Oressa Hunt was safe, adrift somewhere in the void, empowered by Bralin's jury-rigged power cell. But Bralin Levisk was stranded, 5 days deep into a dying station, poisoned and bleeding out. He slumped against the wrecked wall, the exhaustion overwhelming. The fight with the system was over, and he had won using nothing but his knowledge of its fundamental structural failure. He had beaten the hegemony by proving that even their perfection was built on a pile of poorly maintained junk. Bralin coughed again, the sound wet and final. He was alone, surrounded by the ruins of his imperfect victory, breathing air thick with the smell of his own technological vengeance. He wasn't a hero. He was just a mechanic who had successfully demolished his workplace to complete a contract. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the darkness claim him, knowing that the next phase of the maintenance log, survival, was going to be the hardest repair job of his life. And he had no tools left. The colossal ringing in Bralin's ears was louder than the rupture. It took a full minute for his brain to register the true sound of the aftermath. Absolute, suffocating silence. The emergency lights, having exhausted the failing battery, had given up their frantic strobing shriek, settling instead into a low, dim red glow that barely illuminated the ruins, casting the scene in the color of old, dried blood. He was still pressed against the scorched wall, every breath a shallow, painful negotiation. The chemical sting from the coolant vapor was not receding. It had settled deep. A cold internal rot working its way through his blood and muscle tissue. He moved, slowly, an exercise in calculating acute agony. He crawled past the security checkpoint where Karras's 2 remaining troopers lay. They were still breathing, but non-functional, their armor fused in spots, their transponders spitting dead data loops. Karras himself was nowhere to be seen, likely smart enough to have been just outside the primary blast radius, or perhaps dragged into a maintenance shaft by the station's automated cleanup subroutines, now running without centralized control. It didn't matter. The high-grade hegemony problem had been reduced to an isolated structural failure. Bralin dragged himself to the shattered aperture where the external comms hub used to sit. The view was clear. A massive blackened crater. A technological lobotomy that ran deep into the station's exterior plating. He hadn't just silenced Karras. He'd silenced everything. No one would hear the diplomatic chaos Oresa Hunt was now unleashing, a new wave of political instability powered by a crude drone battery. And crucially, no one would hear Bralin Levisk's desperate ping for extraction, should he ever decide he wanted one. Nomara was deaf, mute, and blind. Just him, 6,000 metric tons of scrap metal, and an infinite vacuum. He pushed off the wrecked frame, the exertion forcing a bout of wet coughing that left him weak. Survival now meant securing an atmosphere he could tolerate, and finding some heavy-duty solvent for the neurotoxin currently dissolving his nervous system. He didn't have tools, only his knowledge of the station's messy plumbing. Slowly, painfully, he navigated the ruptured security corridors, heading back toward the relative safety of his workshop, the Verlassung 3 Annex. The atmosphere changed as he moved. The scent of burnt plastic and scorched hegemony circuitry receded, replaced by the old familiar blend of stale, recycled sweat, old grease, and high-voltage electricity, the intimate, comforting smell of Nomara itself. He had beaten the hegemony by exploiting the station's resilience, its refusal to accept perfect order. He had won a political revolution for a woman he barely knew, trading her freedom for his own permanent isolation. It was an excellent exchange. From an engineering perspective, he finally collapsed onto the cold metal floor of his workshop. The auxiliary generator hummed steadily above him, the sound heavy and reassuring. He looked down at his hand, still covered in grime, blood, and the metallic dust from the exploded console. It was the same dirt he'd scraped off the primary environmental recycling unit 6 days ago, only now it was thoroughly mixed with the debris of an empire. He closed his eyes and listened, not to the sound, but to the sensation. The subtle, off-key tremor that had bothered him when he was trapped beneath the recycling unit, the heavy dread of professional obligation, was gone. It had been replaced by a different, deeper, more reliable pulse, the constant, low-grade thrum of Nomara Anchorage fighting for its own structural integrity. He had fixed the high-level human conflict, but the entropy of the machine remained. The universe didn't care about freedom or hegemony. It cared only about flow dynamics and structural integrity. He still needed to fix the broken seal on the primary environmental unit. But now, he had all the time in the void. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.